You noticed how easily the moment returned to your mind. Not loudly, not with urgency. It simply appeared again, the way certain memories do when something about them remains unfinished. At first, it felt ordinary. People replay conversations sometimes. You were only trying to remember what had actually happened. You noticed it while doing something else. A sentence from the conversation surfaced again, the way someone had phrased something, the order of what was said. You went back through it quietly. First, this was said. Then the conversation moved there. After that, something shifted slightly in the tone. You noticed how the sequence mattered. Not the emotion, not the conclusion, just the order of events. You tried to place each part where it belonged. At first, it seemed simple. You remembered the beginning clearly, the moment when the conversation started and nothing about it felt unusual. Then you moved forward in your mind. You remembered the next part, the explanation, the way the story had been told. Still, something felt slightly unclear. You noticed how your mind slowed down at that point, not because you were looking for a problem. You were simply trying to make sure the timeline made sense. You returned to the beginning again. You placed the events in order one more time. The opening comment, the explanation that followed, the small shift in the conversation afterward. You noticed how easily your mind went back to that same place, the part where the sequence felt less certain. You checked the moment again, not with suspicion, not with accusation, just with the quiet intention of understanding what had happened. You listened to the memory the same way you had listened the first time, carefully, step by step. You told yourself it was only about clarity. You were just checking the timeline again. Over time, you noticed how often your mind returned to the same place in the sequence. Not the beginning of the conversation, not the ending either. It always paused in the middle, at the moment where something felt slightly harder to place. You could remember how the conversation started. That part felt stable. The opening comment made sense. The response that followed seemed ordinary enough. Nothing about the first part of the exchange stood out as unusual. Then the timeline moved forward. You remembered the explanation that came next, the way it was delivered, the small details that were included. At first, it sounded clear, almost too clear, as if the story had already been arranged before it was spoken. Still, something about the order felt uncertain. You noticed how your mind slowed down at that point. Not because you were trying to prove anything wrong. You were simply trying to understand how one moment led to the next. You returned to the beginning again. You replayed the conversation in the same sequence you remembered hearing it. The first comment, the explanation that followed, the shift in tone that appeared shortly after. Each time you reached the same place, your memory paused. You tried to place one detail before another. You moved the pieces carefully, the way someone checks the order of events after the fact. You listened again to the exact wording you could remember. You tried to hear the rhythm of the conversation as it had happened. Something still felt slightly out of place. You noticed how naturally your mind repeated the same process. The memory played again. The sequence moved forward. The pause appeared at the same point. You weren't looking for a mistake. You weren't searching for evidence. You were simply trying to see whether the timeline held together the same way each time you walked through it. So you checked it again, and again, Not because you wanted to question what happened, because something about the order kept asking to be looked at once more. Over time, you noticed how carefully you began to listen to your own memory, not with suspicion, not with urgency, just with a quiet attention that hadn't been necessary before. At first, it was simply about clarity. You wanted the sequence to make sense. You wanted the order of events to hold steady each time you walked through it. Still, something inside you began to slow down around that moment in the conversation. You noticed how your mind lingered there longer than anywhere else. The words themselves were familiar. You could repeat them almost exactly. The tone was clear enough. The explanation sounded complete when you heard it again in your head, and yet the timeline around it felt less stable. You began to replay the earlier parts more carefully. The opening comment, the first response, the way the conversation shifted before the explanation appeared. You listened to the memory the same way someone listens to a recording a second time, noticing details that seemed too small to matter the first time. You noticed how often your attention returned to the same point. Not because you were trying to prove anything. You weren't building a case against anyone. You were simply trying to see whether the sequence stayed consistent each time you looked at it. The memory moved forward. Then, your mind paused again. You tried to place the details in the exact order they were spoken. You asked yourself simple questions. What came first? What followed? What changed the direction of the conversation? Sometimes the explanation sounded complete when you heard it again. Sometimes it seemed to leave a small space where something else should have been. You noticed how often that space appeared. You told yourself that memory can blur things, that conversations are rarely as precise as they feel in the moment. Still, the sequence continued to bring you back to the same place, the part where the timeline felt slightly less certain. You noticed how quietly that uncertainty stayed with you afterward. Not loudly, just enough that you found yourself checking the timeline again. At some point, the repetition itself becomes noticeable, not the conversation, not the explanation that followed it, the act of returning to it. You notice how often your mind walks back through the same sequence. The beginning is clear. The first words make sense. The moment unfolds in the same familiar order. Then you reach the same place again, the part where the timeline slows down. You begin to see that you aren't replaying the memory because you enjoy thinking about it. You're replaying it because something inside the sequence never quite settles. You try again, carefully. You place each piece where you remember it belonging. The opening comment, the explanation that followed, the shift in tone that appeared afterward. Each time, the same small gap appears, not large enough to call a contradiction, not obvious enough to name as a mistake, just a small place where the order feels slightly unstable. You notice how much patience you've brought to this process. You've given the timeline space to clarify itself. You've allowed the memory to rearrange itself naturally. You've told yourself that conversations are imperfect and that memory can soften the edges of what happened. Still, the sequence continues to return you to that same place. You begin to understand something simple. If a timeline holds together, it usually becomes easier to remember with time. The order becomes smoother. The sequence becomes clearer each time you revisit it. But this one does something different. Each time you return, the same small pause remains. The same place where your mind slows down and quietly asks whether the order truly fits. You realize that this is why you keep checking it. Not because you want to prove anything, because the timeline itself never quite stops asking to be checked again. And once you see that clearly, the repetition starts to make sense. Eventually, you notice something about the way you have been returning to the memory. Not the conversation itself, but the way your mind approaches it. Each time you go back, you begin the same way. The opening moment appears clearly. The first words land where they should. The conversation moves forward with the same familiar rhythm. You follow the sequence carefully. Then you reach the same place again, the part where the timeline hesitates. For a long time, you treated that hesitation as something you needed to solve. You tried to understand whether you had missed a detail. You wondered if the order had blurred with time. You gave the memory room to rearrange itself naturally. You were patient with it. You allowed the explanation to settle the way it had been given. You listened again to the tone you remembered. You replayed the moment as accurately as you could. Still, the pause never disappeared. It remained in the same place each time you walked through the sequence. You begin to see that the repetition itself has been a kind of answer. You are not returning to the timeline because you enjoy revisiting the conversation. You were returning because the sequence never fully closed. Something in the order kept asking to be looked at again. You notice how quiet that realization is. Nothing dramatic happens when you see it. The memory does not suddenly rearrange itself. The conversation does not resolve itself inside your mind. The same small space remains in the timeline. The same point where your mind slows down. But now you understand why you kept coming back to it. You were checking whether the order could hold together on its own. You were giving the timeline every opportunity to make sense. You were listening carefully enough to notice when it did not. So you stop forcing the sequence to settle. You let the pause remain exactly where it appears, and you stop there. When you checked the timeline again,